20,000 years ago, the Thames never reached the sea. It ran east, joined the Rhine, and the two rivers together crossed a plain of gravel and frozen grass where the North Sea lies today. Their shared channel cut west along the floor of what we now call the English Channel and found salt water somewhere out past Brittany. A person standing on the coast of Norfolk could have walked to the Netherlands without wetting a boot. The ocean at that moment sat roughly 125 meters below the level it holds this morning. All that missing water was still on the planet. It sat on land, frozen, in sheets heavy enough to bend the crust underneath them. Over Hudson Bay, the ice ran close to 3 kilometers thick. A second dome covered Scandinavia and spread south into Denmark and northern Germany, and west across the top of Britain. There was ice on the Alps, on the Andes, on the mountains of New Zealand, and a grounded mass over the Barents Sea where trawlers work now. Added together, the Earth carried something like 50 million cubic kilometers of ice beyond what it carries today. The rock under the Canadian Dome was pushed down by hundreds of meters, and it has not finished coming back. Land around Hudson Bay still rises about a centimeter a year. Old beaches there now sit far inland and well above the water, stacked up the hillsides and steps, and surveyors measure the movement with satellites. The ground is still relaxing from a load that came off it 10,000 years ago. Pull that much water out of the ocean, and the shallow rims around the continents come up into the air. The Persian Gulf drains completely. Sumatra, Java, and Borneo stop being islands. Britain stops being an island. Millions of square kilometers of flat, well-watered, walkable ground appear along almost every coast on the planet. And most of the places we now think of as barriers between regions turn into the easiest routes across them. Doggerland is the name we give the northern one. At the coldest point, it was a hard place. The ice front stood a few hundred kilometers away. The ground stayed frozen through the summer, and wind loaded with rock flour came off the glaciers day after day. Rivers braided across it in shallow silver strands. The famous finds from that plain, the barbed bone points and flint tools that fishing boats drag off the brown bank, mostly date from later and warmer millennia, when the same ground turned to marsh, lake, and woodland before the sea came in. How far north people pushed during the coldest centuries, and whether they wintered there at all, is not something the evidence can currently settle. Europe behind that plain was a narrow place to live. Permafrost reached down to the latitude of the Alps, and real forest survived only in pockets in Iberia, southern Italy, the Balkans, and along the northern rim of the Mediterranean. One widely used estimate puts the entire European population at the peak of the cold near 130,000 people. That figure comes from counting dated sites, weighting them by how much of each region was habitable, and calibrating against modern hunting and gathering groups, so it is a model rather than a head count, and other methods produce numbers 2 or 3 times higher. Even the generous versions leave Europe emptier than a single modern city. The ocean beside them behaved like a different sea. The polar front in the North Atlantic, the boundary where cold northern water meets warmer water pushing up from the south, had slid down to the latitude of northern Spain. Icebergs calving off the European and Canadian ice drifted across the middle of the Atlantic and dropped their cargo of rock on the deep floor, where sediment cores now read those episodes as bands of coarse gravel in fine mud. Much of the difference in European climate comes down to that change in how the ocean carried heat north. In 2010, researchers opened the stomach of a mammoth that came out of the frozen ground in the Siberian Arctic. The contents were mostly grasses and sedges, along with herbs and a little willow. That is a diet no modern Arctic landscape can supply in the quantity a mammoth needs. Multiply one animal by herds and by a range that ran without a real break from the Atlantic coast of Iberia, across Siberia, over the exposed floor of the Bering Sea and into the Yukon, and you have the largest single habitat that existed on land at the time. Researchers call it the Mammoth Steppe. Nothing about it matches the tundra that occupies those latitudes now. Modern tundra is soggy and mossy and poor in nutrition. The Mammoth Steppe was dry, firm underfoot, and productive because grasses and herbs grew fast in a short, bright summer and then cured standing, like hay left in the field, staying edible through winter. That is exactly what a large grazing animal needs to survive a cold season. So the plain carried mammoth, steppe bison, horses in enormous numbers, reindeer, and woolly rhinos. It also carried saiga antelope, whose swollen, drooping nose warms and filters incoming air, and which still lives on the dry steppe of Kazakhstan today, one of the few animals from that world that never left it. Standing there in July would have felt nothing like a polar expedition. The sun stayed up most of the night, the air was dry, and midday could be warm enough to want shade. What never stopped was the wind. It came off the ice carrying fine, pale dust the rock flour glaciers make by grinding bedrock, and it laid that dust down across thousands of kilometers of grassland. Large parts of Europe and northern China are farmed today on soil built out of it. Under your boots, the top half-meter of ground would be thawed and soft in summer, with permanently frozen ground below that for tens of meters. Winters went far below anything most people alive today have felt, and the herds stayed anyway, digging through dry snow to the cured grass. That last detail matters more than it sounds. If the snow had been deep and wet, the whole system would have collapsed. Why grass instead of forest? The air itself was different for a start. Carbon dioxide sat near 180 parts per million, well under 2/3 of the modern figure, and trees suffer at that concentration considerably more than grasses do. The climate was dry, since cold oceans evaporate less, and much of the moisture that did rise fell on the ice sheets rather than the plains. Permafrost held meltwater near the surface where summer roots could reach it. There is a fourth explanation, and it is the one that gets the most airtime. Sergei Zimov has argued for decades that the herds themselves built and maintained the steppe by trampling moss, breaking up shrubs, and cycling nutrients through dung, and he has spent 30 years testing it in a fenced reserve in Yakutia by bringing in horses, bison, and musk oxen. My own reading of the evidence is that the climate explanation carries most of the weight, and the animals were an amplifier rather than the cause, but I would not bet heavily either way. The honest position is that a few square kilometers of fenced experiment cannot settle what happened across a landmass the size of 2 continents. Where ships now cross 50 meters of cold water between Russia and the state of Alaska, there was dry ground, and not a narrow neck of it. From its northern shore to its southern shore, Beringia measured something like 1,600 kilometers. The standard phrase for it, the land bridge, is one of the worst terms in the whole field, because a bridge is something you cross quickly to reach the place you actually want. This was a region with its own rivers, hills, dunes, and willow thickets, big enough to hold populations for thousands of years, and nobody living there was passing through on the way to anywhere. If you like maps that no longer exist, subscribing is what brings the next one to you. People were certainly in the Arctic before the cold peaked. A site called Yana, above the 70th parallel in Siberia, records human occupation about 32,000 years ago. Genetic work on living Native American populations points to a long period of isolation, often placed between roughly 24,000 and 16,000 years ago, when their ancestors were separated from Asian populations and had not yet spread through the Americas. The physical barrier is not in doubt. The Cordilleran ice on the western mountains and the Laurentide ice on the continental interior had merged into one wall across the width of northern North America. The route that opened first along the Pacific Shelf edge is now underwater, which is a large part of why the argument over first arrival has stayed open for 40 years. Lake Bonneville, meanwhile, filled the Utah Basin to roughly the area of Lake Michigan. Its old shorelines are cut into the mountainsides above Salt Lake City like rings in a bathtub, hundreds of meters above the modern salt flat. Lake Lahontan covered much of western Nevada, and there was standing water in Death Valley. The globally drier world was, in the American West, a wet one, because cold air off the ice pushed the storm tracks south, and the runoff had nowhere to drain. Spruce grew across the southern plains. Mammoths, camels, ground sloths, and short-faced bears all lived in that landscape, and whether people did too remains the most argued question in American archaeology. Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and the Malay Peninsula formed one landmass at the time, roughly the size of modern India, which geologists call Sunda. A river larger than any in the region today ran north across it, and its drowned valley can still be traced on the seafloor of the South China Sea. Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania made up a second continent, Sahul, with a large freshwater lake sitting in what is now the Gulf of Carpentaria. Between those two blocks, the water never closed. Those channels are deep, and no drop in sea level joins them, which is why the first people to reach Australia had to cross open water in stages, out of sight of land for part of the way, at least 50,000 years ago. By the time of the coldest phase, their descendants had been there for tens of millennia, and were walking across the dry plain that is now the Bass Strait to reach Tasmania. That plain flooded around 12,000 years ago, and the Tasmanian population lived in isolation from then until European contact. The dry Persian Gulf held the combined Tigris and Euphrates, running the length of the basin toward the Gulf of Oman. Jeffrey Rose has proposed that this valley worked as a refuge, a well-watered lowland where people concentrated while the surrounding deserts were at their harshest, and that the sudden appearance of settlements around the Gulf Coast later on reflects those populations being pushed uphill by the rising sea. It is a good idea. It is also, at present, an idea whose evidence would be sitting under 60 meters of seawater, and I would treat it as a hypothesis worth funding rather than a result. Sea level curves themselves are not guesswork. Certain corals grow only within a few meters of the surface, so a drilled reef gives a dated record of where that surface stood, and the cores taken off Barbados and Tahiti are why we can put numbers on the deglaciation century by century. Sonar has mapped the shelves in enough detail to trace old channels and shorelines. Pollen in lake mud shows which plants grew where. Bubbles in Antarctic ice hold real samples of the ancient atmosphere, which is how the carbon dioxide figure is measured rather than modeled. What is well established is the global average. What varies, sometimes by tens of meters, is the local figure, because crust that carried ice is still rising, and crust around the edges is sinking, so any regional coastline map carries real uncertainty at the edges. Cold and dryness work together, and the effects reach the equator. Ice cores from that period carry up to 20 times more dust than layers from the warm period we live in, because there was more bare ground and stronger wind to lift it. The Sahara was larger than the modern desert, with active dunes hundreds of kilometers south into what is now the Sahel. Glaciers came down the flanks of Kilimanjaro and Mount Kenya and capped the highlands of New Guinea, a few degrees from the equator. The older claim that Amazon rainforest broke into scattered islands surrounded by savanna has weakened as pollen records improved. The forest seems to have held on across most of the basin, several degrees cooler and drier in places, with a different mix of trees. Every human being alive at that moment lived by hunting, fishing, and gathering. Global population estimates vary between the low millions and a few 100,000, and the spread is not sloppiness. Genetic methods measure effective population size, which counts only the individuals who left descendants and typically runs an order of magnitude below the real head count, while archaeological methods depend on how many sites survived and were found. Two honest approaches, two different questions, two different numbers. Their equipment was not crude. Needles with eyes, the same design your grandmother used, appear in Siberia around 40,000 years ago, which means fitted, sewn, layered clothing cut to the body, without which none of the Arctic occupation happens at all. At Kostenki in Russia, people assembled a circular structure about 12 meters across out of the bones of more than 60 mammoths, roughly 25,000 years ago. The recent excavation found so little sign of hearth debris or living waste inside that the team argued it was not a house, and what it was for is unresolved. In a cave at Xianrendong in southern China, potters were firing clay vessels 20,000 years ago, about 10,000 years before anyone planted a field.
Fuel tells you as much as tools do. On open steppe with almost no wood, hearths at sites across Central and Eastern Europe are full of burned bone, and experiments show that fresh bone will hold a fire once it is going, since the fat inside it burns. Getting one started still takes kindling, so groups were carrying scraps of wood or dry dung with them and treating them as a resource. Somebody in that camp had worked out the fuel budget for a winter in a landscape where the nearest stand of trees might be several days away. What that world lacked is worth one sentence and no more. There were no fields anywhere on the planet, and no settlement that stayed occupied all year. Everything else follows from those two absences. Nobody stored a surplus, so nobody could support a person who did not get food. Nobody owned land, because owning ground you leave every autumn means nothing. Around 19,000 years ago, the orbital cycles governing sunlight at high latitudes shifted. The sheets began losing more than they gained, and the ocean started to climb. During the episode called Meltwater Pulse 1A, about 14,500 years ago, sea level rose somewhere between 14 and 18 meters in 3 or 4 centuries. Roughly 4 centimeters a year sounds modest until you stand on a flat shelf, where a vertical centimeter can move the water line several meters inland. A person born on such a coast could watch a familiar camp become a beach and then a lagoon. Beringia closed as a walking route around 11,000 years ago. Doggerland shrank to marsh and low islands and was effectively gone by 8,000 years ago. Which leaves a problem I think gets nowhere near enough attention. Coasts are where people prefer to live, for the fish, shellfish, birds, fresh water, and easy travel. And for the whole of the last ice age, that coast was out on the shelf. The sites that survive on land are the ones people made inland, and above all in caves, because caves protect what is left in them.
So the standard image of Ice Age humans as cave dwellers scraping through the cold is partly a sampling artifact. We are looking at the archive that happened to stay dry. One place shows exactly what has been lost. Off Marseille, a diver named Henri Cosquer found a tunnel in the limestone in 1985, 37 meters below the surface. It runs upward for about 170 meters and opens into a chamber that stayed above the water. The walls are covered in paintings and engravings, horses, bison, and also auks, seals, and what appear to be jellyfish, animals that no other decorated cave in Europe shows. The dates cluster around 27,000 and 19,000 years ago. When those images were made, the sea was 11 kilometers away, and the entrance was an ordinary hillside opening.
Rising water sealed it, and rising water is now eating the lower paintings, which is why France has built a full-scale replica. Nobody has any idea how many more of those hillsides are out there under the Mediterranean shelf, because almost nobody has looked. If you were funding one survey of a drowned coastline, which one would you pick and why? Leave it in the comments and subscribe if you want more journeys through versions of this planet that no longer exist.